But the most useful alliances generally proceed from shared fears. The best motivator to fight is self-defense. Thus, states that have a shared interest in preventing Chinese or Russian or Iranian hegemony themselves have a natural alignment with our own interests. This is true whether or not they are democracies.
Well, look at Mr. Peanut just saying it like it is. Wow. So this guy who wrote our current defense strategy and who will have the ear of the incoming Secretary of State just straight up said that they don't give a fuck about what kind of government a country has as long as they'll partner with the World Trade System dudes out of fear. Let's just be clear about what we just found out here, or at least got confirmed, which is that what we're doing isn't about democracy. It just isn't. It's about economics. It's about money. It's always about money. And China, in particular, being really, really smart, too smart with theirs.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, and thank you for listening to episode 225 of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And congratulations, you have made it to the end of 2020. Well done. You survived. But this is going to be the last episode of Congressional Dish for the year. And so before I say anything else, I do want to thank you for listening to Congressional Dish and for sharing Congressional Dish, and especially for producing Congressional Dish. We are now going into our 5th Congress, and I definitely would not still be doing this without you. So thank you so much. As I end this year, there's actually a lot to be grateful for, but very high on my list is you. So thank you so much for supporting this show. But as we are at the end of the year, this is when Congress gets really crazy, and we are right now in the lame duck. And this one is a little bit crazier than usual because Congress has not funded the government. Government funding runs out on December 18th. We haven't gotten any COVID relief since March, and so there's been negotiations about that. And then also there's the War Authorization that needs to become law by the end of the year. So there's some very important deadlines. And so basically December has been me sitting around waiting to see what's going to happen. And so instead of just sitting around doing nothing, I decided to do some research to prepare myself for the work that I know I have coming, which is this legislative avalanche that is likely to become law by the end of the year. But, you know, government funding could get kicked again into the new Congress, and COVID relief might not happen at all. And so the thing I decided to focus on was the War Authorization, because I knew pretty much for certain that that would become law by the end of the year. Now, one of the reasons I felt certain about that is, using history as a guide, Congress hasn't failed to authorize our wars in over 6 decades. So that shows you exactly what the priorities have been in Congress for double my entire lifetime. But like, based on that history, I was pretty sure they'd get it done. And then now that we're in the middle of the month, I also now know that the NDAA has passed the House and the Senate by overwhelming margins. And so even though Trump has threatened to veto it because, well, the guy who claims he's not a racist in any way wants to veto the NDAA because it authorizes changing the names of some army bases from Confederate soldier names to other people's names. Trump's willing to veto that change. And then also he's really pissed at Facebook and Twitter in particular, because since he's been like lying so much about winning the election, which he did not do, but he keeps saying that he did. Well, Facebook and Twitter have been labeling his lies. And so he's really pissed about that. So what he wants is a dingleberry attached to the NDAA, because it is must-sign legislation, that would repeal Section 230. Now, I talked about Section 230 in the last main episode, the one that's about social media censorship. But Section 230 is essentially the legal immunity that social media companies like Twitter and Facebook have for what we say. So without Section 230, they could get in trouble for what we say on their platforms. And basically, Trump is just being vindictive. He wants them to be eligible to be sued because he likes to sue people. He is litigious and he likes to abuse our legal system. So, I mean, you can kind of see what Trump is doing with that. But what would really happen if you repealed Section 230 on a whim like this is that it would fundamentally change what the internet is. And so the Republicans are not on board with that effort. And he's trying to do it attached to war authorizations. And so, unlike funding the government in his border wall, which they wanted the wall and they don't really care if the government's funded until their constituents freak out, war authorization is different. They all care about the war authorization. And so that veto threat has been met with both sides of Congress being like, oh, we'll just override that. So they already have the numbers. They've already said they're going to do it. So we don't even know if Trump's going to veto, but moral of the story is that the NDAA is going to become law. Also, you should know that it's 4,517 pages. And so while the focus is on the naming of bases, there's a lot more in that bitch, which is why I'm going to read it. And so knowing that this is going to be on my to-do list in the beginning of the next year, I just felt like I had to kind of catch up on what's going on in the world, because since COVID, I haven't been paying much attention to our regime change operations because, well, for the most part, those seem to have been put on pause too while the entire world dealt with this pandemic. But now with the election of Joe Biden to be our next president, the world trade system has the United States back, baby. Joe Biden, of all people, is going to be president in a month. So we're returning to normal, which means we need to start watching the free Marketeers again. And so for this episode, to catch up and prepare myself to read that 4,517 page monster when it becomes law, I listened to 9 hearings that took place this fall, and I collected a bunch of clips about which countries appear to be on the bipartisan shit list. And today I'm going to share those clips with you. Now, I do have some backstory as we go through these clips, but I think you should just know up front that this episode's more of a collection of dots to be connected later. So think of this as a lot of mini stories as opposed to a real deep dive into one overarching thing, because in some cases here, just to be straight up with you, I found some clips interesting, even though I essentially don't really know what the hell is going on in the countries they're about. So the way I see this is I'm going to throw information at you and then we can figure it out together going forward. And I actually really love doing that, figuring out what's going on in the world together as we collect more and more dots. That's the entire fun of the Congressional Dish community that we have here. And so I love doing episodes like this where I say okay, here's the thing. And then you guys fill in the blanks for me with the information that you have in your brain banks. And we'll figure out as much as we can about where the world order chessboard stands at this time. Because, if we can't stop the rules of the world from being written for multinational corporations, and if we can't stop the wars that are and will be fought to enforce their rules and make them global, well, we might as well at least watch them, like a world order soap opera, which is soon to be starring Grandpa Joe. So be sure to tune in starting January 20th, 2021. Yeah, so today we're going to look at the locations and the cast of characters and just kind of, see what's going on in the world. And I am also just, very well aware that if you're new to this community, you might not really know what I'm talking about when I say, we're going to connect the dots about the world trade system, other shit like that. I imagine that you might be picturing me as a lady parts wielding Glenn Beck right now, which is, I kind of get it. I know how nuts all this sounds. And honestly, maybe I am a little nuts because I do think it's a little nuts to compulsively watch government the way that I do. But the thing that makes me different, at least I think, is that I make sure and spend a lot of time and money actually to make sure that I'm backing up what I say because I believe trust is earned. And so one of the ways that I earn your trust is that I turn down all advertisers because when companies provide you your income, you're inclined to make them happy. And to make them happy, you tailor your episodes to suit them, or at the very least, to not piss them off. And so that dynamic has poisoned our corporate produced media. And so I'm doing something different here and producing a show for you instead. And so part of the effort in producing a show that serves you is building your trust by giving you all my sources, all the timestamps, because these hearings are long. So you should be able to get right to that clip and hear it in context if you want to. I give you all the links to the articles and documents. Everything that I use is in every episode show notes for you. And so that is how I earned your trust. And then I trust on my end that you'll pay for these episodes in return for the value you receive for them. And I leave that amount up to you because I don't know how much you value this podcast. Only you do. And so you get to decide. And so if you believe that this is a good way to fund this podcast and you want to participate in this community and in this way of sharing information, all of the ways that you can contribute to Congressional Dish are listed in every episode's show notes, along with my sources on congressionaldish.com and also within a lot of podcasting apps. A lot of times you just have to go to the information part of the episode and you can click the links right from there. And by the way, thank you to everyone who does that. I just want to repeat again, this show exists for you and because of you. So thank you so much for making this possible. The point is that our entire relationship is based off of trust. You know, you trust me because I give you my sources. I admit my mistakes at the beginning of episodes right after they're caught. And I've promised to never lie to you. I tell you what I believe to be true, regardless of how outside the common wisdom my thoughts may be. And I gotta tell you that this episode, and really most foreign policy episodes since I really studied the World Trade Organization for the first time for episode 102, well, these type episodes really challenge the mainstream lines, if you will. But the good news is that when you have a where the hell is she getting this from moment, well, there's 8 years of public record in the form of Congressional Dish episodes to explain exactly where I'm getting my impressions of global affairs from. And there are a few key episodes that will provide so much key background and context for this episode and for the episodes about war authorization and government funding to come in the next few months. And so one episode that I really think you should listen to is episode 102 about the World Trade Organization. That episode is when I discovered that our Congress was killing some food labeling requirements here in the United States, not because a single American eater was asking them to do that, but because of a ruling in a World Trade Organization, not a court. That was the door to the rabbit hole for the world trade system, and it's deep. It's so deep. So that's a good one. Check that one out. Also, there's Congressional Dish 167 called Combating Russia. That episode was about the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act, which of course became law. But that episode has probably my best summary of the regime change that the Obama administration successfully pulled off in Ukraine. Now, most Americans, even though I know most Congressional Dish listeners are aware of it, most Americans aren't aware that that happened or that we had anything to do with it. And so they consider the Ukraine regime change a smashing success. What's important to note here is that Joe Biden was in charge of that operation as vice president. He said so himself on camera. And so since he's about to become the president of the United States, that story is worth knowing in detail. And then last, I would love for you to listen to episode 186 about the National Endowment for Democracy, because that episode was my door to the non-governmental organizations rabbit hole. And I feel like I've only just started peeking behind the kimono or whatever they say into that one. But this rabbit hole is vast. And because of that, the next few minutes I know are going to be review for those of you who have already listened to the National Endowment for Democracy episode. Like I said, that full episode is worth your time because there's a lot of illustrative sound clips in there. And I've included a link to all 3 of those episodes and a few more for you in this episode's show notes. But the National Endowment for Democracy episode was released 2 full years ago. And so even I needed a little refresher when I started this episode. But I think you need to understand and remember what these organizations are so that you can understand who you're hearing from today. Mainly so that you can understand who's being called to give advice to our lawmakers. Because so many witnesses in these 9 hearings had ties to the 3 organizations that I highlight in that episode: the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, and the International Republican Institute. And I really don't want the significance of that to be lost on anyone as I introduce the witnesses today. So, as fast as I can. The National Endowment for Democracy is a private foundation that receives millions of our tax dollars and then hands our money out to groups that work to change the governments of other countries. Now, some of those changes are welcomed by the countries where they operate because some of the work they fund is like teaching other countries how to hold legitimate elections. Like, here's a process for registering voters, and here's how to operate on election day, and here's how to count votes. And by the way, we have some machines here that these multinationals can sell you. Elbow, elbow, wink, wink. But the point is that some of the work that they do, if you believe in the idea behind democracy, that voters should choose their leaders via elections, well, some of their work makes elections possible. And that's the good work that they hide their regime changes behind. But regardless of what goal is actually being pursued at that moment by the National Endowment for Democracy and the groups that they fund, the labels for their work is always democracy promotion. They've totally hijacked the word democracy. But the big picture really isn't about democracy at all. Another thing that I think will be proven in this episode today. Because what our entire foreign policy has been centered around since at least World War II is coordinating efforts to remove the governments of countries that don't submit to the rules of the World Trade System, which is operated by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. This is a system in which no ordinary citizens get to vote and therefore is not a democracy itself. The World Trade System, which is at least what I label it, is an economic system whose rules are currently based on being crafted to allow freedom, not for individuals, but for markets. Freedom for multinational businesses to operate anywhere and everywhere they choose, and to extract profit for the investor class that owns the majority of the shares of multinational corporations. Any country that enacts economic laws that challenge corporate freedom is considered an enemy to this system. And the overall goal here is to have every country on earth obey the World Trade System laws. And the good that these people think they're doing in enacting this system is that they really think that if all countries are connected economically, there will be no more wars. They all think they're doing this for the goal of world peace, even if it takes 7 decades and counting of wars to get there. And so, the idea falls apart pretty quickly when you don't have millions in stock clouding your judgment, but this is where we are. Now, the United States' role in all this is that our military is the muscle for this effort to make the world trade system the economic system of the entire world. And our State Department enacts the system in other ways, coordinating the writing of trade agreements, which write the World Trade System laws. And the State Department is in charge of propaganda and other sneakier methods of getting other governments to comply. And the way this generally works is that if the State Department fails in their soft power type methods, then the spooks at the CIA and our other 16 intelligence agencies, well, then they move in. And if the spooks can't pull off the regime change, well, then it's shock and awe, full-blown war, like what we saw in 2003 in Iraq. The National Endowment for Democracy is a player in the State Department side of the game. The National Endowment for Democracy was created in 1983, so within my lifetime, by President Ronald Reagan, who was a corporate salesman given the powers of the President of the United States. According to the National Endowment for Democracy's own website, it was created in order to take over many of the election interference tasks that the CIA was caught doing in the 1970s, which back then were treated like scandals, as they should be. But basically, the National Endowment for Democracy was created to bring cover to our regime change efforts. Because even though it was created by an act of Congress and is funded with our tax money, the National Endowment for Democracy is a private, technically non-governmental organization. And that non-governmental organization or NGO status, that's what allows it to raise money from groups outside the government too. So they can take our tax money, but private money on top of it. And so even the CIA didn't have that much financial freedom. According to the person who's been president of the National Endowment for Democracy almost since its founding in 1984, Carl Gershman, he said, quote, "The idea behind making the National Endowment for Democracy private was to remove it from all of the entangling diplomatic obligations of the United States," unquote. So it was designed to get around U.S. diplomatic obligations. It was designed to break the promises that we've officially made to the world. The National Endowment for Democracy does its dirty work by funding local groups that use the local media and local humans to fight figuratively and sometimes literally for corporate-friendly reforms in their target countries. It's basically an organization that passes out money to control foreign governments or overthrow them if they prove too resistant to changing their laws to give rights to multinationals. The people in charge of the National Endowment for Democracy are known warmongers. Its chairman is Andy Card. Andy Card was George W. Bush's chief of staff when W overthrew the government of Iraq. Another person sitting currently on the board of directors is Victoria Nuland. She's the one that longtime listeners will remember as the former Assistant Secretary of State during the Obama years, who was caught on tape accurately planning who would be installed in the new government in Ukraine before that government was overthrown in 2014. Before removing Ukraine's government for President Obama, in partnership with Vice President, soon-to-be President Joe Biden, Victoria Nuland was Deputy National Security Advisor to then Vice President Dick Cheney in the overthrow Iraq years. So, a lot of the people involved in these organizations, they'll work with warmongers in both parties. The parties agree on wars. But anyway, another person on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy who played a key role in the Iraq regime change is Elliott Abrams. He was in the W. Bush administration from a few months before 9/11 until the very end. And he was a Deputy National Security Advisor specializing in Middle East policy during the W years when they planned the overthrow of Iraq. But you're probably more familiar with him, though, if you listen to Congressional Dish, for being the dude put in charge by the Trump administration of the ongoing and so far total ridiculous failure of a regime change operation in Venezuela, which is the country that limits the amount of money multinational oil companies can extract from the largest known pool of oil on Earth, which exists under Venezuelan soil. Now, Elliott Abrams is still on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, but I should note that he's currently on leave while he's empowered to conduct that regime change in Venezuela as a representative of our government. But what's even crazier about the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy is that members of Congress are also on the board. And there's one current representative that I really want to highlight, and that's Karen Bass of California, because she's on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. But right now, she's also the chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations. And so a member of the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy, an international organization, is the chairman of a committee that's supposed to perform oversight of international organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy. So basically, Karen Bass is conducting oversight of herself. And so Karen Bass of California, remember her name because you'll be hearing from her today. Because in addition to her being in a position to police herself as a board member of the National Endowment for Democracy, as a member of Congress, she also gets to participate in the government funding process. And so she's able to funnel money to herself to pass out to... Because this organization does get millions of our tax money to pass out every year. And half of the money, it just goes all over the place. It's handed out to thousands of groups that do God only knows what all over the world. Because there are tax forms that tell us the names of these groups and what amounts they get. But tracking what each one of them do with the money, some of these groups don't even have a website. So who knows? And it is my suspicion that the high difficulty level of finding out who these groups are and what they actually do is kind of the point of funding them with this method. And so that's where half the money goes, just fucking everywhere. But then the other half of the money goes to 4 groups who are well known. And so one of the 4 is the American Center for International Labor Solidarity, which represents union workers. The second of the 4 is the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is an affiliate of the Chamber of Commerce, which represents big business. So that's fitting for the goal of all this. But then there's the 3rd and 4th organizations. Each of these organizations get at least $20 million a year in tax money from the National Endowment for Democracy, plus their private money. And these 2 organizations are named the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute. These 2 organizations don't in any way even try to hide their purpose, and their purpose being to change the governments of foreign countries. So, for example, under What We Do on their website, the International Republican Institute says it, quote, builds citizen-centered governments, unquote. And then under Where We Work, it lists every continent on Earth except for Antarctica. Then on the National Democratic Institute's website, it says they have, quote, promoted democratic development across 5 continents, unquote. And that they have helped, unquote, with 350 elections in 85 countries. They also say that they have, quote, supported, unquote, which generally tends to mean gives money to 16,000 organizations, 925 political parties, and 10,000 lawmakers. How's that for foreign interference in elections? It just doesn't seem to be a problem as long as American Republicans and Democrats are the ones doing it. And I say that because these two organizations, as their names, the International Republican Institute and National Democratic Institute suggest, these two organizations are the Republican and Democratic parties. Now, both organizations say on their websites that the connection to the parties either doesn't exist or is a, quote, loose affiliation, unquote. But the memberships speak for themselves. When I researched these organizations for episode 186 2 years ago, every single member of the International Republican Institute was a member of or a major donor to the Republican Party, and every single board member of the National Democratic Institute was a member of or a major donor to the Democratic Party. And so I didn't go person by person in my research for this episode today because who has the time to do that twice? But I did a quick glancey glance at the membership and it looked largely the same as last time 2 years ago. But anyway, the chairman of the International Republican Institute is current Senator Dan Sullivan, who was just elected to another 6 years. But this is a guy who's completely devoted to fossil fuels as a senator from Alaska. He's joined on the board of directors for the IRI, as they call it, by warmongering psycho current Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. Another person who has a seat on the board of the IRI is the senator who salivates every time he talks about overthrowing Venezuela, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. And then, of course, Senator Lindsey Graham, the author of the bill I nicknamed the Authorization for Limitless War. Of course, he is on the board of the International Republican Institute. You know, that's a lot of warmongers on one board. A lot of warmongers with power. How is something with that many senators private? I just can't. And then there's the Democrats version, the National Democratic Institute. Now that one has no current members of Congress on the board, but the board of directors is made up entirely of members of the Democratic Party and extremely influential ones at that. So like the current chairman of the board at the National Democratic Institute is the former Secretary of State during the Clinton administration, Madeleine Albright, who has moved on now to form a powerful lobbying company, Albright Stonebridge Group, that helps multinational companies figure out how to get what they want from governments. Joining her on the board is former senator from Minnesota and Democratic Vice President Walter Mondale, who is 92 years old and still trying to rule the world. But he and Madeleine Albright are also joined on the board by a whole bunch of former members of Congress, including former Democratic North Dakota senator turned lobbyist Tom Daschle, former senator from Maryland Barbara Mikulski, former Congressman Sam Davidson of Connecticut, and former Congressman turned lobbyist Howard Berman. And while these following board members are not current or former members of Congress, their connections and ranks within the Democratic Party are too high to be ignored. And so I'm referring to current board member Howard Dean, who is the former Democratic governor from Vermont and former chairman of the Democratic National Committee. There's also filthy rich investment banker Richard Bloom, who's married to Senator Dianne Feinstein. And then there's Dennis McDonough, who is President Obama's former chief of staff, and he's the person who President-elect Joe Biden just announced will be a member of his cabinet as a Secretary of Veterans Affairs. You know, those are some heavy hitters. And what's crazy about these private groups that have these people in charge of them is that they're getting tax money and private money. It's all just so shady. And so clearly, I have serious concerns about the existence, leadership, and work being done by these organizations. Concerns that stem right from their founding as organizations meant to outsource and legitimize the scandalous deeds of the out-of-control CIA. The way I see them in this moment, I mean, I'll change my mind if anyone can prove to me I'm totally wrong about this. But after all the research I've done, the National Endowment for Democracy seems to partially serve to funnel tax and private money to powerful members of the two American corporate parties. And by using this particular money funnel, these corporate politicians get to call themselves private and use that cover of a private non-governmental organization to fund other groups without any real oversight. Oversight they would absolutely be subject to if these groups were just funded directly by the corporate party operatives who have weaseled their way into our government. And so even if they do some good work helping countries who want to administer elections, and, you know, based on what I've seen in some of these hearings, I'm sure that they do. So, like, here's a clip for you. This lady, Therese Lanella, I think is how you say her last name, but she was the head of electoral processes at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Whatever. I don't really know what that is. But her testimony was so, like, election nerdy. And I just, like, loved this lady. Like, You all know that I'm a poll worker and I like administering elections. I'm very proud to wear my sticker and to help old ladies figure out how to cast their ballot. Like, I love elections. I just do. I think it's cool that we get to choose our leaders, and I actually wish we had more control over the process and didn't leave so much of it to the corporate parties, those being the Republicans and Democrats. But anyway, I digress. This lady just reminded me of like a full-time poll worker. And in the hearing, she just like fully geeked out on the process of administering elections and what they can do well and what are good strategies and what are bad strategies, what's secure, what isn't. I just like didn't get the I'm trying to rule the world to allow corporate pillaging vibe from this lady, you know? She struck me as a democracy true believer, and she was definitely my favorite witness as like a person, you know? And here's what she said towards the end of the hearing that took place on September 10th.
Your people are excellent. I really want to say that. I'm calling in from Sweden. I'm not American myself, but I have worked in this business for 28 years, working in different countries in really tough situations. And some of the best experts out there are from organizations that are very close to those of you when you're normally working in Washington. So the United Nations as well, based in New York, but also organizations like IFAS, NDI, our colleagues from IRI, they are doing excellent work supported by USAID. So, and they've kind of got it figured out how to support institutions for the long term. So you can trust the people that you are supporting.
And so to hear her say that, like, I'm sure that these organizations are doing some good things in the world. I'm sure that they are helping some countries administer more secure elections. But as with most things, this is a world of nuance. They have a long history that they don't deny of using their money to change the direction of foreign governments. They do exist to interfere in foreign elections. And following the money leads you quickly to notice a pattern of them supporting groups that want a world free from multinationals. And so I don't trust them. As someone who wants freedom for individuals, not international rights for multinationals who trash our planet and hoard our financial system's wealth, largely by making sure that workers get paid as little as possible and that governments provide as little to the people as possible so that we're desperate and that we serve the corporate system. And like, freedom for these multinational companies really does mean indentured servitude for the people of the world. And so that's my concern about all of it. What concerns me on a bigger picture, what concerns me on a like this episode level is that a lot of the people who gave advice to our lawmakers this fall are affiliated with the National Endowment for Democracy and the corporate party institutes that get National Endowment for Democracy cash. So all the hearings that I watched took place since Congress returned from their summer vacation, so since September. And as I was collecting a lot more clips than I have time to share with you today, even though I'm sure this is going to be a long episode, but there were so many clips that I'm just not going to get to. But my goal here was to try and figure out which governments are being targeted for intervention. And I was looking for the ones that are not obvious, because all of us seem to know that we're involved in Afghanistan and Iraq, and most of us seem to know at least something about our involvement in Yemen. Like, for those of you who don't, real quick, Obama and Biden started bombing Yemen in 2015 as a way of supporting the not a democratic government of Saudi Arabia. And then in the Trump years, the direct bombing has been done more by Saudi Arabia, but with American weapons. And so episode 195 about Yemen, that gives you the backstory on what we're doing there. But then there's also North Korea, always on the ship list, Iran. I did an episode about Iran less than a year ago, actually, when Trump assassinated the Iranian equivalent of a defense secretary. And what's so crazy is that was this year. You know, I started 2020 having panic attacks about the possibility of World War III and actually ended up doing very little foreign policy work, to my surprise, because the entire world had to unite to kill a virus. You know, maybe that's a silver lining of COVID, if you want to look at it that way. COVID helped us avoid World War III with Trump as the main general. Go COVID. But anyway, these countries that I just listed were obviously mentioned here and there, but we kind of know the deal with all those situations already. And we also know that big picture, our real beefs are with China and Russia. And the reason underlying all of it is that Russia and China are challenging the global dominance of the world trade system by operating economies that don't follow the world trade system rules, and those two countries have the militaries to make their challenges legit. We heard this particular testimony that I highlighted in episode 218. That was the episode about the global competition to own the world's minerals. A competition that China is like if this were Mario Kart, China is in first place where not even a red shell can hit them, and the rest of us are just in the back scrambling with the other characters for a distant second. But in that episode, we heard from Meredith Sumter. She is a intelligence spook who lived in China and did some stuff for the State Department and the CIA during the George W. Bush and Obama administrations. After leaving the government, or doing whatever people associated with the CIA do, do they ever actually leave? But on her LinkedIn, at least, it says that she left government and that she spent 3 years as a director at the Bauer Group Asia, which is one of those private firms that specializes in helping multinational corporations expand around the world. And when she testified this summer, she was the head of research strategy at the Eurasia Group, which is another private firm that helps multinationals make money. And so basically, this is a woman that the multinationals pay to tell them what's going on in the world. And this is what she told our Congress this summer.
Beijing decision makers believe that their state-directed economic system is the foundation of the livelihood of their political system. In other words, we have been spending our energies trying to force China to change, and China is not willing to change an economic model that it believes underpins its political longevity.
And that's why China bad. And the overall impression that I got by watching these hearings that took place in the fall is that there is, I'm not going to say that it's a unanimous consensus, but there is a growing consensus that China is moving into our enemy number one position, kicking Russia out of the lead. So here's Janusz, I'm going to butcher this name and I'm sorry, but here's Janusz Bugajeski, who was asked to give advice to the House on December 8th about what to do in the Balkans, so what to do in Eastern Europe during the upcoming Biden administration. This person is a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, which is an NGO created around the same time as the National Endowment for Democracy that credits itself with spreading information that helped to destroy the Soviet Union. This guy also currently hosts a TV show in the Balkans.
Let me begin with why Russia is not a longer-term danger. Russia is a country in serious decline, economic decline. Its economy is the size of a medium-sized European state. China has the second largest economy in the world. Russia has internal problems with its nationalities, with its regions, with increasing public unrest, with increasing opposition to Putin. There may even be power struggles during the succession period over the next 4 years. Russia faces major internal problems. China, on the other hand, unless, of course, there is opposition to the Chinese Communist Party from within, is in a different stage. It continues to be a very dynamic country in terms of its economic growth. It doesn't face the sort of internal contradictions and conflicts that Russia does. And it's increasingly, and China's always looked at the longer term. In other words, it's not, they don't even have to look at succession cycles because of the dominance of the Communist Party. They are looking eventually to replace Russia as the major rival of the United States. And the best way to do that is to increase their influence, not only militarily in East Asia, South Asia, and other parts of the world, but economically, politically, diplomatically, culturally, and through the media. And that's precisely what they're doing, not only in Europe, but in other continents.
So it's kind of fascinating that a guy in Eastern Europe is saying that Russia is not the number one threat to the region. China is, and that's new. And the idea that China is the new number one devil was repeated by many other witnesses, including ones currently empowered in our government. So here's David Stilwell. He was the Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the State Department. Here he is testifying in September.
For years, we in the international community credited Beijing's commitments that facilitating China's entry into the rules-based international order would lead to increasing domestic reform and opening. Beijing's persistent flouting of these commitments has shattered those illusions. It is now clear to us and to more and more countries around the world that PRC foreign and security policy seeks to reshape the international environment around the narrow interests and authoritarian values of a single beneficiary, that is the Chinese Communist Party.
And China as number one bad guy was also preached by those who are likely to be power adjacent very soon. So the next person you're going to hear from is Elbridge Colby. And just Elbridge, that name. This whole guy, everything about Elbridge just oozed wealth and entitlement and arrogance. You know, this is a guy who went to Harvard and Yale, and he totally looks like the type of person who could be seen unironically wearing a top hat and a monocle. In fact, once that image popped into my head while watching this hearing, I basically saw Elbridge Colby as a young Mr. Peanut. I couldn't get that out of my head. And I've been giggling about Elbridge the Peanut for weeks while working on this episode. So whenever you hear the word Elbridge, just know that I am talking about this very, very, very rich dude. And even though you've probably never heard of Elbridge, this was the first time he's even appeared on my radar. But it turns out that he's a pretty powerful dude in like the secret part of our government, and he's been lurking around the halls of power for a very long time. So like in 2003, he did some kind of work, who knows, installing the new government of Iraq. Then in 2004 and 2005, he was on George W. Bush's WMD commission. Then after that, from 2005 to 2006, he helped to somehow create the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And by the way, none of that I just told you is listed on his LinkedIn. That I know from articles and stuff. But what he wants the world to know is that starting in 2010, for 7 years, he worked at the Center for a New American Security, which is a think tank funded by the war industry where Joe Biden's pick for CIA director, Avril Haines, is on the board of directors. And when Trump became president, Elbridge Colby became the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. And he was the person who was basically in charge of writing the 2018 National Defense Strategy. This guy has power. After he finished that, he then went back to work pimping out the perspective of the war industry at the Center for a New American Security, which he did until he founded something called the Marathon Institute in May of this year. Now, the Marathon Institute position is the one that was presented on the hearing information about Elbridge, but he holds another position right now, too, one that's more important to me, because he is right now a senior advisor to West Exec Advisors, which is a company name that everyone should put in your brain bank and let me know every time you see it pop up. Because West Exec Advisors was co-founded by Antony Blinken, who is our incoming Secretary of State. This is the guy that Joe Biden has picked to be Secretary of State. Antony Blinken's partner in founding West Exec Advisors, Michelle Flourney, told The Intercept in 2018, quote, "We help tech firms who are trying to figure out how to sell in the public sector space, to navigate the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and law enforcement," unquote. And so this guy, Elbridge, was hired by the incoming Secretary of State to help his company make money by getting their war industry clients government contracts. And so this guy, Elbridge, is obviously a servant of the war industry who is trusted very much by the incoming Secretary of State, so much that he pays this dude to work for him. And so Elbridge, the top hat-wearing peanut, is a guy worth paying attention to. And he was invited into our Congress to tell them what's really going on in the world. And I must tell you, he is a blunt little peanut. And you'll see exactly what I mean. But here's what he told Congress in September, which basically boils down to China is challenging our economic dominance, which makes China bad.
Allies and partners are absolutely essential for the United States in a world increasingly defined by great power competition, above all with China. Indeed, they lie at the very heart of the right U.S. strategy for this era, which I believe the Department of Defense's 2018 National Defense Strategy lays out. The importance to the United States of allies and partners is not a platitude, to the contrary. For the first time since the 19th century, the United States is not far and away the world's largest economy. More than anything else, this is due to the rise of China. And as has become very evident, Beijing is increasingly using its growing power for coercive purposes.
And here's how China's using its power. This is Philip T. Rieker, who has been in the State Department since the Clinton years, and who gave this testimony in September as Acting Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, which is the position that Victoria Nuland was in when she orchestrated the regime change in Ukraine in 2014. But here's what Rieker said about China.
Using platforms like the One Belt, One Road initiative, the Chinese Communist Party endeavors to create dependencies and cultivate client-state relationships. Through the 17+1 initiative, which involves 12 countries that are both NATO and EU members, primarily in Central and Eastern Europe, China aims to achieve access and ownership over valuable transportation hubs, critical infrastructure, ports, and industries.
And here's what Elbridge, the powerful peanut, says that we have to do about it.
Because of China's power and wealth, the United States simply must play a leading role in blocking Beijing's pursuit of hegemony in Asia. This means that the U.S. defense establishment must prioritize dealing with China in Asia, and particularly on defending vulnerable allies and partners such as Taiwan and the Philippines.
Now, it was really interesting to me that he said that in order to challenge China's economic dominance, that we have to support the Philippines. Because just this week, I read that the International Criminal Court had released a report that detailed the president of that country, Rodrigo Duterte, that detailed how he has committed crimes against humanity, including the murders and torture of thousands of people. You know, it's gotten to the point now that the name Duterte is pretty much synonymous with bad guy, and Congress knows it. And so here's a National Endowment for Democracy board member who, in this capacity, was serving as the chairman of a Committee on Foreign Affairs subcommittee. But here's Representative Karen Bass of California.
President Duterte of the Philippines is accused of lawfare or weaponizing the law to deter or defeat freedoms, personalities, and establishments that promote human rights, press freedoms, and the rule of law, while also cracking down on individual freedoms.
And yet our policy has been to support that government. And now Congress is being told by Elbridge to keep it up. So why?
Our effort to expand our network of allies and partners should really be focused on states with shared threat perceptions. It has become something of a commonplace that shared values form the bedrock of our alliances. It is true that such values help bind allies, but the most useful alliances generally proceed from shared fears. The best motivator to fight is self-defense. Thus, states that have a shared interest in preventing Chinese or Russian or Iranian hegemony themselves have a natural alignment with our own interests. This is true whether or not they are democracies.
Well, look at Mr. Peanut just saying it like it is. Wow. So this guy who wrote our current defense strategy and who will have the ear of the incoming Secretary of State just straight up said that they don't give a fuck about what kind of government a country has as long as they'll partner with the World Trade System dudes out of fear. I mean, we've long suspected that this is the case, but to just say it like that, whew, what a blunt little peanut. Although he didn't really have to worry about too many people hearing him say that, so it wasn't that brave of a thing to do, because there were no members of the public allowed in the hearing room because of COVID. In fact, he wasn't even in the room, which is why the sound quality was like that. It was a virtual hearing. And also, this hearing wasn't aired on television, on C-SPAN here in the United States. And so less than 1,000 people have bothered to click play on the hearing on YouTube. In fact, this podcast is going to air that clip to at least 6 times as many people as had maybe heard it before. And even then, this is such a small podcast that that's not enough for them to give a single fuck. So very few people will know that that quote was said in the halls of Congress. But what was even crazier than him saying that was the reaction of Congress. So, like, here's the chairman of the main House Armed Services Committee, the one that writes the National Defense Authorization Act every year. Here's the chairman of that committee, Representative Adam Smith of Washington, reacting to what Elbridge just said.
When should we just say, look, we're not going to worry about your domestic politics. We want to build the alliance however possible. How would we deal with, extreme human rights abuses as are alleged in the Philippines in terms of extrajudicial killings, or in the case of India, and of course we're dealing with this with Turkey and Europe as well, is doing the arms sales with Russia. Should we significantly back off on our sort of sanctions policy for those things? And if so, how do we signal that without undermining our credibility?
Oh my God. the right answer here would be, oh, nah, dude, we stand for democracy, so we can only partner with democracies. But that's not what he said. Instead he's basically like, okay, makes sense. But how do we avoid getting called out as the shameless hypocrites that we are? And so let's just be clear about what we just found out here, or at least got confirmed, which is that what we're doing isn't about democracy. It just isn't. It's about economics. It's about money. It's always about money. And China, in particular, being really, really smart, too smart with theirs. And so basically, we're going to try and get as many countries as possible to partner with us instead of China. That's the big game. But here's a member of Joe Biden's transition team, Christine Wormuth, who has spun around in the revolving door a few times, having worked for a consulting firm, helping multinationals make money, and then going into government to design the Obama administration's war policies at the Department of Defense, and then going right back through that revolving door to ride out the Trump years at the war industry-funded Rand Corporation think tank. Well, here she is testifying to our Congress in September.
The challenge is that many of the countries in the Indo-Pacific don't want to have to choose between the United States and China. They want to engage with China for very clear economic interests, while most of them lean towards the United States for security interests. And I think they're trying to sort of thread that needle.
And so I think we're about to find out how the threading of that needle is going to go for a lot of these countries. But I did learn in these hearings that the World Trade System has had one recent success in getting into one of China's neighbors.
We need to make adjustments to our posture in the region to be able to better deal with China. And so the announcement by Palau, for example, that it's willing to host U.S. airfields and bases could be quite helpful to us, even though they're relatively small. We do need to diversify our footprint.
And so U.S. troops, more of them, are going to a country that most of us have never heard of. Again. And here's a fascinating explanation for the big picture reason why. Here's Elbridge the warmongering peanut.
In a sense, what we're going to need to do to leverage this greater power of this network, allies, partners, whatever the role, is going to be interoperability, the ability to work to different standards, to communicate with each other. That's partially a technical problem and an equipment problem, but a lot of it is just a human training and culture and organizational issue. In fact, Taiwan, I think I'm very enthusiastic about the arms sales to Taiwan, and I know that one was recently reported. I hope it goes through because it's the kind of equipment that we would want to see, this kind of A2AD denial kind of capabilities to Taiwan. But actually where I think, would be really valuable to move forward with them, and that's obviously a sensitive issue, but I think this would be within the context of our traditional policy, would precisely be on training, and that's something we could think about with Vietnam as well. Obviously, the Indians have a very sophisticated military, but there maybe we can offer there too. So I think that's a real sort of force multiplier.
And so we're going to put our troops in that region, train the locals to be able to take commands from our military when needed. They call that creating interoperability. And we're going to sell a whole shitload of weapons to those partners, regardless of if those countries are democracies or not. And so knowing that this is the overarching goal in the region now, I do want to highlight a few countries that were mentioned repeatedly in the hearings in a way that makes me think that they might be regime change targets, and one of them is Cambodia. One of the reasons I think this is the Cambodia Democracy Act, which passed the House last spring so overwhelmingly that they didn't even record a vote, which basically means it was unanimous since no one even tried to stop it. And so we can safely assume that these are ideas with support in Congress, even though it hasn't made it into law yet. But these are exactly the type of bills that get dingleberried into law onto things like the NDAA or funding laws. And so this is one of the things I'll be looking for when I read those bills. But for understanding of our policy purposes, all of these types of bills have a list of sins in the beginning of them that explain why the targets of the bill are being punished. And the sin named first in the Cambodian Democracy Act, which declares economic war on members of the Cambodian government and companies controlled by the Cambodian government. Well, the first thing on the sin list is that the government passed a law in 2015 that essentially allowed the Cambodian government to kick non-governmental organizations out of the country if they're suspected of interfering in Cambodia's political processes. So this would kick out NGOs like the National Endowment for Democracy and the NGOs it funds that literally exist to interfere in political processes. Oh, and by the way, the propaganda term for these types of groups is civil society. And I'm sure you'll hear it at some point today because I heard it over and over again in the hearings, and that phrase was also in this bill. But anyway, 2015, Cambodia gave itself permission to kick civil society out of its country. And then in 2017, the government used that authority to kick the National Democratic Institute out of Cambodia. Also that same year, they ordered radio stations to stop airing Radio Free Asia and The Voice of America, which are U.S. propaganda stations operated out of the State Department. And then, of course, the bill makes all kinds of claims that I have no way to really verify, but it's the usual stuff, like their election was a fraud, they must enact reforms. But basically, Cambodia is on the shit list. That much at least we know. And Congress is taking the first steps towards doing something about it. And asked to give his advice on the Cambodia situation to Congress was Daniel Twining, who is the president of the International Republican Institute. This guy was handpicked for the position by Senator John McCain before he died and left the International Republican Institute chairmanship to Senator Dan Sullivan. But in this clip from September 22nd, with the president of the National Democratic Institute, which was recently booted from Cambodia, also sitting in the witness table, Dan Twining said this. And by the way, you're going to hear a reference in this testimony here to our GSP, which stands for Generalized System of Preferences, which basically means that we have a World Trade System economic partnership with whatever country has a GSP with us.
Thank you, Congressman. You've been such a leader, including with your Cambodia Democracy Act. And, that's a reminder that we do have tools and leverage. The Europeans in Cambodia have suspended trading privileges that they had offered to Cambodia. Cambodia is very reliant on our GSP still. So some of these economic instruments matter in both a negative sense, but also in a positive sense. When countries do well, we should be working with them on new trade and financial arrangements. The Chinese do come in and do this in their own way, and we should get back to that as a country. Sir, you mentioned do we withdraw support when a country backslides on democracy? I would argue that most of our support for countries should not go directly to their governments. It should go to independent civil society, free media, independent institutions, and not just go into a central coffer that disappears. In the past, we've gotten a lot smarter about this as a country, but in the past, a lot of U.S. development assistance disappeared because we were giving it to friendly autocracies in some cases who did not have any means of accounting for it. So let's make sure that we invest in these democracy and governance instruments because we want to make sure that U.S. taxpayer money is being used well.
So first of all, the congressman he was talking to there is Representative Ted Yoho of Florida, who wrote the Cambodia Democracy Act. I forgot to tell you that. But as for the clip, his advice was to just, what you should do is not fund the Cambodian government, but instead funnel even more money to civil society groups like the one that I'm the president of, which are the very groups that Cambodia is kicking out of their country for interfering in their domestic politics. So these people are so greedy and so fucking shameless that just blows my mind. And so I will be checking in the NDAA and the funding laws to see if Congress takes that advice and funnels even more money to groups like his. Okay. Another country that was repeatedly mentioned in this conversation was Sri Lanka. And so here's a person who was called to testify along with the presidents of the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute. This person is on the Council on Foreign Relations. Her name is Dr. Alyssa Ayers. She was working at a consulting firm called McLarty Associates, which says on its website that it's, quote, at home in corporate boardrooms and government cabinet rooms anywhere in the world, unquote. And she worked there until she was asked by the Obama administration to serve as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, which she did for 3 years. Afterwards, though, she spun fully through the revolving door and is now back at McLarty Associates, helping multinationals make money around the world. And she doesn't like what she sees in Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka, after a 5-year period of improvements, is now moving in the other direction with the return of the Rajapaksa government. The new political configuration will not pursue progress on reconciliation and accountability for the end of the civil war, and the newly elected parliament is already hard at work with a constitutional amendment to expand presidential powers.
So that doesn't sound like they're pleased. And the president of the International Republican Institute, Dan Twining, is also saying that Sri Lanka is on his list.
Beyond China, the past year has seen countries once viewed as bright spots for democracy, like Malaysia and Sri Lanka, regress due to political infighting, personality politics, and failure to deliver promised reforms.
You must deliver your reforms. And so I guess we have to add Malaysia to the list, too. So when it comes to the Asian region, the countries that seem to have targets on them in some way, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia. Those are 3 Asian countries that I think we need to keep an eye on in the NDAA funding laws and in general. And so if you are going to help me do the NDAA and funding law bills, please send me whatever you think I need to see about those 3 countries. You can email me, jen@congressionaldish.com, or even better, tweet me what you have at Jen Briney. Okay, so China. Let's summarize the big picture of what has emerged so far. China is taking over as the #1 bad guy because their economy is getting big enough to compete with the world trade system. To combat this, we're going to partner with whatever governments are willing to partner with us, regardless of if they are peaceful or if they are democracies. But just because China is now the #1 bad guy, Russia is still a thing. So here's Philip Rieker, the acting Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, testifying in September.
Although China's GDP is about 8 times the size of Russia's, Russia remains the primary military threat to Europe and the strategic priority for most of our allies and partners, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe. Russia and China are more closely aligned strategically than at any point since the 1950s. And we see growing cooperation across a range of diplomatic, military, economic, and information activities.
And so what should we do about that, Mr. Peanut?
In Europe, finally, the overall U.S. goal should be, while preserving the fundamental U.S. commitment to NATO's defense, to have Europeans, especially in Northern and Eastern Europe, shoulder more of the burden of defending the alliance from Russian assault. The reality is that, given the stakes and consequences, the United States must prioritize Asia. The United States must therefore economize in its second theater, Europe.
Economize! Well, isn't that a fun way to say spend less money on? And it's not just Europe where Congress is being told to economize our efforts so that we can focus on China.
In particular, we will not be able to dedicate the level of resources and effort to the Middle East and Europe that we have in the past. We will therefore need allies and partners to do their part, not just to help defend our interests and enable a concentration on Asia, but to defend themselves and their interests.
And knowing that this guy is one of the main guys who wrote Trump's 2018 National Defense Strategy, this makes sense when I hear it. Because, Trump wants to pull 12,000 troops out of Germany, and he's been pushing NATO alliance countries to spend more money on war things. And so you can see this idea being done with Trump's policies. But again, Elbridge works right now for the incoming Secretary of State. And the whole pivot to Asia, that was an Obama administration thing. And so when I look at this, it looks quite likely that this is one of those things that the corporate parties more or less agree on. But that doesn't mean that the anti-Russia operations in other countries are over, even if there is a consensus that China is going to be our #1 threat and our #1 priority in how we spend our massive amounts of military money. And there's one country that seems very high up on the regime change target list because of its current relationship with Russia. Here is the National Endowment for Democracy board member and chairman of the Committee on Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, Representative Karen Bass of Los Angeles, California.
What concerns me most is that democratic backsliding is not limited to Africa, and we seem to be in a place of retreat from democracy that I only hope is an anomaly. In Europe, we see the egregious behavior of Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, who claimed success in a disputed August 9th election and sought support from extranational resources such as Russia to justify his claim to power.
It's never good when a Democrat lately says that any president has power because of Russia. The current president of Belarus, who we're talking about right now, has been in power for 26 years. And like she said, he won an election in August with over 80% of the vote, which you have to admit is a suspiciously high number. But as we know, the world trade system doesn't give a fuck about democracy being functional if the country is willing to partner economically. And so that's really where Belarus's president is committing his unforgivable sins. Because Belarus has been militarily and economically partnered with Russia. So, for example, it refines Russian oil so that Russia can sell its oil to the world. And the president of Belarus has generally refused to privatize its own industries, as the International Monetary Fund wants it to do. Belarus has also decided to accept some loans for some infrastructure projects from China. And so Belarus is doing all the things that the world trade system hates the most. And it's not good when congressional advice about a situation in a country like that starts sounding like this. So the next witness you're going to hear from is Joanna Rohozinska, who recently left her high-ranking position at the National Endowment for Democracy to take a high-ranking position at the International Republican Institute. And her testimony was on September 10th and was not televised in the United States.
Lukashenko must be held responsible for his choices and actions. Coordinating strategies with transatlantic allies should be a priority and include calls for dialogue, immediate release of political prisoners, and support for the political opposition's demands for holding new elections under international supervision and beginning negotiations on a post-Lukashenko transition.
A transition? Uh-oh!
I would certainly invest in looking at calling early parliamentary elections as being much more significant, because once you turn the House, once you turn the Parliament, then at least you start building up a degree of political capital that can start carrying forward into the governance.
So they want a transition, and one of the steps that they're talking about is to flip Belarus's version of Congress before the next scheduled election. And so let's keep an eye out for headlines announcing any early elections in Belarus. And again, Congress's reaction was shocking to me. Although, is it shocking or is it just gross? I don't know. But here's Representative Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania talking to the International Republican Institute lady.
In 2013 and 2000, we saw large-scale protests in Ukraine following what many believe to be a falsification of elections by their federal officials. So my first question for the entire panel, do you believe that Belarus protests could lead to a revolution similar to the one we saw in Ukraine? And secondarily, on Tuesday, President Lukashenko refused to rule out the idea of holding new elections and acknowledged that he may have overstayed his time in office. Whether or not you see a revolution similar to Ukraine, do you think that these protests could lead to an actual change in leadership?
So I take it was a question to me. I think that things have been building up, and I would say that the similarity to Ukraine was that there was also a deep-seated frustration with corruption. Here it's less about corruption, but it still meets where you have the accountability and transparency aspect of it that I was mentioning in my testimony. And I think that the frustration with the lack of responsive government and being treated like animals, frankly, is what they say, is what finally boiled over. But there's been an uptick in protests in Belarus, if you watch these kinds of things, over the past 2 years, over the parasite tax, for example, which was a special tax that was put on unemployment and on to penalize people who were unemployed. It was trying to target civic activists, but it ended up reaching far farther than that. So you could see things percolating below the surface for quite a long time now. You never know when it's going to blow. Here, I think that there was just the COVID underlay everything, and it mobilized such a broad swath of society that the trigger event was finally the elections, which again, demonstrating a degree of hubris, they decided not to put off, right? They figured that holding the elections at the beginning of August was the best thing to do because there's always a low turnout in August, frankly, because people tend to go out to the countryside. So they simply miscalculated. They did not understand how the people were feeling, and here you do have a similarity with Ukraine, I think. In terms of the other questions to going forward, you have to appreciate that this is a country that's never experienced democracy ever, which means that even the democratic opposition and the leaders basically know it from textbooks. They don't know it from firsthand practice. Lukashenko himself, ironically, has been supporting the notion of sovereignty and independence in the face of the Russian state for the past couple of years, and he only changed his tune a couple of weeks ago, when he started getting backed into a corner. In terms of his promises of calling new elections, I would be wary. He does not have a particularly good track record of following through on promises, and so I would probably take that as a lesson learned and be extremely cautious. I personally think he's just buying time, because he also said that he would consider holding new elections after introducing constitutional changes, and the constitutional changes that he was proposing is to introduce term limits. So, I mean, he's still looking at the succession. He understands that this is the end of his time in office. I don't know if he wants to do that right exactly now. However, understanding that this would have been his last term anyways, he was probably preparing for an exit strategy.
So Congress hears testimony about this situation in Belarus, which is Ukraine's north side neighbor, and is told that a transition, a regime change, should be on the menu. And our Congress seems not only on board, but now wants to know if the Ukraine regime change recipe, which involves protests literally cheered on in person by senators from both parties and members of the Obama administration, like on the protest stage. So protests that we were involved in, they want to know if that recipe can be copied in Belarus. And so what I'm seeing is that the conversation about changing Belarus's government has already progressed beyond the should we do it to how do we do it. And most Americans don't even know that Belarus is a place. But here's another one of the interesting bits of advice to Congress about how we start the regime change in Belarus. This witness is named Jamie Fly. This guy was in the Defense Department and on George W. Bush's National Security Council during the W. Bush years. He then went to work for warmongering nutcase Senator Marco Rubio of Florida during the Obama years. And then he became the president and CEO of the State Department's international propaganda networks called Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty during the Trump years. And right now, along with Elbridge Colby, he's currently working for West Exec Advisors, which is the consulting firm founded by the incoming Secretary of State that helps multinationals make money around the world. And here's his advice to Congress about Belarus.
We have tools. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has a Belarusian language service, Radio Svoboda, which has significant followers inside Belarus. The problem is that Lukashenko, like many other authoritarians, have realized that when they face significant pressure, they should take the country offline. And the Belarusian authorities have done that on a regular basis, which makes it much more difficult to communicate and allow information to spread freely. So what they really need, outlets like Svoboda and other independent media, are access to internet circumvention tools, which are also funded by the State Department and the U.S. Agency for Global Media.
So send in the bullshit artists and fund them with our tax money. But if the bullshit artists can't sway the people of Belarus to protest their government and demand early elections, and of course, vote for who the World Trade System wants in those elections, well, there is another option standing by. Here's James Anderson, who is the acting Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Department of Defense when he testified to Congress on September 30th. Although I should let you know that he has since resigned after Trump fired his boss, Mark Esper. But that doesn't really matter because he told us that this is happening. And in case you don't have the Eastern European map memorized, Poland is next door to Belarus.
As we continue to implement the NDS, our efforts at enhancing our European posture beyond the EUCOM Combatant Command Review have shown recent successes, including the signing of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement with Poland in August that will enable an increased enduring U.S. rotational presence in that country of about 1,000 U.S. military personnel.
So the muscle's being positioned next door. And so Belarus, they are definitely on the target list. And so I'll be making sure that I read everything in the NDAA and the funding laws that mentions that particular country. And again, if you know anything, send me everything you've got. Another country that appears to maybe be on the target list in Eastern Europe is Serbia. So this is recently fired, but still empowered Representative Elliot Engel of New York.
Serbia has been importing Russian fighters and tanks and conducting military exercises with the Russian army. A U.S. Defense Department report told us that Belgrade's drift towards Moscow has mostly occurred since President Vučić took power. At the same time, democratic space in Serbia has shrunk in recent years. Freedom House describes Serbia as a, quote, hybrid regime, unquote, not a democracy because of declining standards in governance, justice, elections, and media freedom. If Serbia wants to become part of the European Union and the North Atlantic family of nations, it needs to get off the fence and embrace a Western path.
And there's also signs that Bosnia is on the shit list. So here's Madeleine Albright testifying on December 8th. Madeleine Albright is widely respected as the first Secretary of State with lady parts. But I know her as the former board member of the New York Stock Exchange, who is currently the chairman of the National Democratic Institute. She's also chairman of the Albright Stonebridge Group, which is a global strategy and investment firm that helps multinationals make money around the world. And here she is telling Congress about Bosnia.
On Bosnia, the Dayton Accords stopped a war and continue to keep the peace. But the governing arrangements are now captured by leaders among the three groups that negotiated the peace. They want to hold on to power, even if it means holding their society back, while Bosnia's neighbors move toward EU membership. The United States and the European Union must focus their efforts in Bosnia on the abuse of government and state-owned enterprises, taking away the levers of power that keep the current system in place.
State-owned enterprises. Everything must be privatized. And so Bosnia, not privatizing everything, probably on the shit list. And so what does Mrs. Albright want us to do with our foreign policy in Bosnia?
The answer is for the United States and the EU to work together to champion initiatives that help Kosovo, Bosnia, and others build economic ties to Europe and the neighborhood, while also pushing for needed political reforms.
Surprise, surprise. And so basically in Europe, I think we need to keep our eyes definitely on Belarus, and then kind of second to that is Serbia and Bosnia. And then finally, we definitely need to talk about Africa. Because while we Americans might not be paying any attention in any way to Africa, even less attention than we pay to other places in the world, Africa's completely off our radar. But the World Trade System disciples are focusing on Africa big time. So this is Christopher Fomono. He is the Senior Associate for Africa at the National Democratic Institute, and he is a guy who has worked at the National Democratic Institute for 27 years. Here's what he told our Congress.
NDI has over 3 decades of technical assistance to and support for democratic institutions and processes in Africa, and currently runs active programs in 20 countries.
20 countries. So these creepy-ass NGOs are all over Africa, and so are World Trade System governments. So here's Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. He is the former commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe during the Obama years, who is now on the board of advisors for Spirit of America, which is something I had never heard of, but we should probably keep in mind, because it is an NGO funded by bankers with a board of directors that is made up of CEOs of multinational corporations and a board of advisors that is full of corporate titans and famous government names, including James Mattis, Stanley McChrystal, H.R. McMaster, George Shultz, Jay Johnson, and one of Congressional Dish's favorite warmongers, Jack Keane. So he's definitely all up in the multinational game. He's definitely high-ranking in the military world. And this is what he said is going on in Africa.
You know, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain all have extensive efforts going on in Africa. So this is an opportunity, once again, where we can work with allies to achieve what our objectives are.
And so what are those objectives? Well, this is where I start to sound a little Glenn Becky again, but it's true, so I have to say it. There is a plan in the African Union, which is called Agenda 2063, that plainly explains the World Trade System's objectives. And you can read all of this on the African Union's website. It's actually really easy to find because I put it in the show notes for you. But basically, the World Trade System people are creating an African continental free trade area, which will create laws that economically integrate the countries of Africa into the World Trade System. As part of this effort, which is going on right now, they want a continent-wide central strategy for managing Africa's mineral wealth, basically taking the power to make those decisions about what to do with the minerals and which companies get to profit from them away from the local communities and giving that power to the World Trade System leaders. They want to do the same thing, essentially, for African money in general by creating an African customs union, an African common market, and an African monetary union by 2023. And to get ready for that, they're creating an African investment bank and at least 2 stock exchanges. Now, the carrots for the African people in all this is that along with financially merging the countries of Africa, the plan is to have an inner open borders policy with the other members. Exactly like in Europe, where you only have to show your passport once and then you can wander around traveling or even moving fancy-free between the countries if you're a citizen of one of them. And that goes for people, but more importantly for the World Trade System, that goes for products. And so in these free trade zones, there's no taxes administered to move companies and products around, in this case, Africa. But I gotta tell you, as a traveler, you have to admit that these unions of countries are kind of nice. And I think that's the biggest carrot that the World Trade System has, at least in my opinion, which is that there are these conveniences that we all benefit from in their system. You know, like ATMs are everywhere now because of the multinational banking system. There's one currency for dozens of European countries in the region. You don't have to change the money every time you go over the borders. You don't have to go through customs all the time. And then for the people in these unions, they can move around and work easily in different countries, and it's all super convenient. You know, remember that Simpsons episode when Homer sold his soul to the devil for a donut? Well, like life's conveniences. That's our donut. And that's what we get in this system, and it's a pretty tasty donut. But anyway, back to Agenda 2063. One of the central features is also funding, managing, and allowing multinationals to profit from, and possibly even co-own, huge African infrastructure projects. So, for example, one of the projects in Agenda 2063 is the African Speed Train Network that's supposed to connect all African capital cities and industry hubs. Now, it's yet to be known if passengers or freight are going to be prioritized, but based on the rail system here in the capital of the World Trade System in the United States, I'm guessing passengers aren't likely to be the top priority over the movement of corporate crap, but we'll see. This project is just getting started. Agenda 2063 is also facilitating the construction of the Great Inca Dam, a long-delayed project during which multiple dams are supposed to be built in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a country rich with the valuable minerals cobalt and tantalum, minerals needed for cell phones, along with diamonds, gold, and uranium. I know we've even have some U.S. troops that have been stationed there during the Trump years, and basically control of the Congo is a prize that the World Trade System has been coveting for a very long time. Towards that end, I also know that we've been involved with overthrowing the government of the Congo at least once in the 1960s. The Congo had just been granted independence from the Belgian government that had been controlling it for more than 5 decades. And the World Trade System, which includes Belgium, did not like not being in control there. And the new democratically elected government was overthrown in less than a year. But right before that overthrow, there were plans in progress to build the first 2 Inca dams. The plans were originally dreamed up by the Belgians who were controlling the country, and their plans were to hire multinational corporations to build the dam for the benefit of industry that was operating nearby. The Congolese people would only benefit from the project if they had some kind of connection to the foreign companies that would use the energy to extract wealth from the Congo. But those plans got fucked up when the Congolese people successfully, but briefly, took control of their own country. The democratically elected prime minister, in the few short months that he was allowed to stay alive, intended to nationalize some industries that the multinationals wanted to control to extract profits from, including the mining industry, which, as we know, is a big no-no when the World Trade System is in charge. And so they shot the first democratically elected prime minister a few months after his election and installed a dictator who partnered with the multinational corporations that the World Trade System laws were written for, and they built the first 2 dams. But of course, the dams were built with money lent to the government of the dictator by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which saddled the country with enormous debts incurred to pay the U.S.-based multinational Morrison Knudsen International, which was contracted to build those dams. But in the end, only about 20% of the energy potential of those dams was ever realized, because they built the infrastructure to supply almost all the power to the aluminum and mining industries. And when those industries tanked in the 1980s, there weren't any substations that could redirect that power to local communities that really could have used the power. It's all so tragic. But fast forward to now, and the World Trade System wants to refurbish the old dams they built to provide energy to industry again, and they want to build some new dams to be run and possibly owned by private companies. When completed, the plan is to send half the power that it generates to South Africa. And the other half of the power that stays in the Congo, much of it would go to the same mining regions that benefited from the power generated by the first two dams. They're not learning from their mistakes. The current phase of this project raises some eyebrows for me because the current government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo seems poised to allow the new dams to be built and maybe even owned. It's not clear. But the multinationals that have been chosen by Congo's government are 6 Chinese companies and a multinational based in Spain. But that would be a huge project, with 75% of the control being granted to the Chinese. And I just can't imagine that the World Trade System goons are pleased about that. And yet this is a project that they're financing. And so, maybe they care more about the power supply for the mining industry than they do about the dam project itself. But that's a dynamic that I guess I'm just saying it's worth watching. But outside the World Trade System, there is another group that is not pleased with the Inca Dam plans, and they are the 30,000 human beings living in the nearby village whose town will be placed under a giant lake if this project moves forward. But who cares about the peasants, right? And so right now, Congo's government appears to be on the official good list because the government is being spoken about in Congress as something worth supporting. So here's John Temin. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the director of the African program at Freedom House, which is an organization that gets most of its funding from the National Endowment for Democracy.
Nascent democratic transitions in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Gambia, and Angola also call for strong U.S. support.
But basically, what we need to know big picture is that the World Trade System is trying to do the same thing in Africa that they've done in Europe, essentially turn all of the countries on the continent into essentially states in an African Union that all share economic laws that allow multinationals to profit and allow the tax-free movement of their stuff around. And yes, people get to move around easier too. But again, we're the muscle for making these country consolidations happen. We've been the muscle for 70 years. And according to a bill that's been introduced by the National Endowment for Democracy board member, Representative Karen Bass of California, the U.S. has recently, let's just say, gotten involved, because I don't know the details. But we recently did something for, quote, peacekeeping, unquote, in Somalia, the Central African Republic, quote, in the Lake Chad Basin, unquote, in Mali and in Sudan. And they're clearly worried that whatever power they got in Mali is slipping away. This was a theme that was recurring in the testimony. So here's Christopher Fomono again. He's the guy who's worked at the National Democratic Institute for 27 years and counting.
It is important that the government of Mali regain its feet and regain its commitment to democratic government and a professional military that can help working with the partners, for example, the French with the Operations Barkhane and other United Nations peacekeeping forces to curb this spread. Because if Mali falls, if any one of the countries in the Sahel falls, then the coastal countries along the West African coast are going to be immediately hit. And that would mean that would be very catastrophic for the rest of the continent.
So what they seem to be so concerned about is that the government in Mali was recently overthrown in a military coup. Mali, which is a country with gold and cotton, has essentially been a violent mess since 2012 after the Obama administration and friends overthrew Libya, which gave terrorists their own lawless state to organize and cause chaos in neighboring countries. In 2013, a president that we seemed to deem worthy of our support was elected in Mali and then re-elected again in 2018. And that's the guy that was just overthrown in a military coup. The Mali situation, though, doesn't seem focused on integrating the economy as much as the other regime change targets that I've highlighted today. This one really does seem more focused on stopping jihadists from running buck fucking wild all over West Africa. But honestly, to tell you the truth, this is one of those areas that I warned you about where my knowledge is super limited. But that said, this exchange about Mali was fascinating and I want you to hear it. So here's Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota coming in with a real question for the National Democratic Institute's Christopher Fomono.
Did the Malian military officers who led the recent coup Asimi Gota receive U.S. military training? And if you can just say yes or no, because I have a few more questions and we have limited time.
Well, I do not have specific information on that point, but there have been reports of capacity building for Malian military as it's been fighting the violent extremists in the northern and middle part of the country, and that some of those soldiers or units may have trained alongside U.S. forces in the Sahel.
And I gotta tell you that great questions like that are why the machine really hates Ilhan Omar. But that whole exchange just provides yet another example of the strategy that we just heard them discuss for Asian countries, where we train local troops to do what we want, we buy them weapons. Here's another example of that backfiring when those humans do what they want with the weapons and training instead. And this happens all the time. And so there's that. And I guess the moral of what I'm trying to say here is we're clearly not pleased with what's happening in Mali. We've apparently stopped sending millions of our dollars to the Mali government since the coup happened. And I do know that there's thousands of troops in Mali right now from a bunch of World Trade System countries. So this situation is a mess. And so I just think we should have Mali on our watch list because shit's going down. And then there's a few more African countries that I think belong on our watch list as well. So here's Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey speaking at the end of September.
I fear that 2020 may see an even greater decrease in democracy on the continent. Today's hearing is also timely, as elections are approaching next month in Tanzania and the Ivory Coast, both countries which appear to be on a downward trajectory in terms of governance and respect for civil and political rights. And I want to note that Chairwoman Bass has introduced legislation with respect to Tanzania, and I'm very proud to be a co-sponsor of it, and I thank her for that leadership.
So 2 things to highlight there. Number 1, those elections have happened since the hearing. The Ivory Coast government that we're being told is in a downward spiral, so the one on the shit list, they won the election with 94% of the vote, and the shit list government of Tanzania won with 84% of the vote. So those are 2 suspiciously high numbers. So that's one thing. The other is that Tanzania is being legislated by Karen Bass, the board member of the National Endowment for Democracy.
Most concerning is the situation in Tanzania, which I recently addressed in House Resolution 1120, where current leadership is repressing the opposition and basic freedoms of expression and assembly in a blatant attempt to retain power.
And so in the bill that Karen Bass wrote on the sin list, it says that the contracts and business operations of multinationals are not being shown, quote, respect, unquote, and that's threatening business investment and partnerships. And about a year ago, in the fall of 2019, Tanzania's government started requiring NGOs to register in the country, and then Tanzania changed the law in a way that, quote, severely restricted, unquote, companies and NGOs' ability to, quote, receive foreign funds, unquote. So, Tanzania be fucking with the National Endowment for Democracy's money. And Karen Bass, their board member in Congress, has written a bill that would issue Tanzania an official list of demands, which includes changing their laws to allow NGOs the freedom to assemble people and operate freely in their country. And so that's a bill that also has NDAA dingleberry potential. And I'll check to see if it becomes law. But that almost doesn't matter because the point is more that this was written by Karen Bass. She is the chairman of a committee that is supposed to police NGOs, and she's on the board of an NGO. And yes, that seems to be an offensive conflict of interest. But she's a fascinating person to watch because she knows damn well what these NGOs are up to. Also, Tanzania's government is partnering with the Chinese for infrastructure partners. It's on Team Belt and Road. So, for example, they're in the process of an $11 billion port project with the Chinese. And so basically what I'm saying here is Tanzania is officially on the shit list. Karen Bass also wrote a bill that she would like to become U.S. policy for Ethiopia because it appears that a World Trade System government is unraveling there right now, too. So in 2018, shortly after his election, the Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, immediately started the process of enacting reforms aimed to merge Ethiopia's economic laws with the World Trade System, which included privatizing the telecommunications, energy, and airline industries. In fact, he won a Nobel Prize for how fast he enacted those reforms. But general elections were supposed to be held this August, this summer. but he postponed them. He said that was because of COVID-19, and then said that the new dates for the election would be sometime in May or June 2021. He didn't actually set a date. But at best, the election would be maybe held 9 months later than scheduled. Now imagine how we would have felt if Donald Trump had postponed our election until July 2021-ish. Maybe. Well, the people in Ethiopia felt that. And so in early September, a region in northern Ethiopia basically said that and held their own election anyway. The World Trade System favored Prime Minister then essentially declared war on that region that held the election against his wishes. He sent in troops, shut down phone and internet services, and killed people. The same week that was all going down, though, Donald Trump did a Donald Trump thing, throwing some unexpected chaos into the mix when his State Department announced out of nowhere, essentially, that they would punish Ethiopia for not adhering to a solution proposed by the Trump administration to solve a water rights dispute with Egypt and Sudan, because the construction of this dam in Ethiopia is going to limit how much water Egypt receives from the Nile. And so he was basically doing a favor to Egypt. And so an Ethiopian government, favored by the World Trade System, a government actively trying to privatize profitable Ethiopian industries for them, was punished by Donald Trump right at the same time that government was being challenged by a democratic election held within its borders. Oh, man. You just can't write this stuff. But yeah, so here's some testimony about that situation. This was testimony from September 30th by John Temin. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and director of the Africa program at Freedom House, which again gets most of its funding from the National Endowment for Democracy.
In Ethiopia, there are deeply concerning signs that the government is reaching for tools of repression that many hoped were relegated to history. Nonetheless, Ethiopia remains on a tentative path to democratic elections that can be transformative. In this context, the decision by the United States to withhold development assistance from Ethiopia in a quixotic and counterproductive effort to influence Ethiopia's negotiating position concerning the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is bad policy that should be reversed.
And a few days after that hearing, Karen Bass introduced her Ethiopia Bill. The very first thing the bill says is that the government that indefinitely postponed the election and then declared war on its own people for having an election is, quote, a key ally, unquote, quote, an important economic and security partner, unquote, and, quote, a major troop contributor to international peacekeeping, unquote. 2 paragraphs down, she also praises the election-canceling government for, quote, taking steps to privatize the economy and promoting private sector investment, unquote. While later paragraphs do acknowledge that the government's violence against its own people happened and that there were mass arrests and internet shutdowns, the part of the bill that matters would direct the U.S. government to, quote, immediately allow all obligated bilateral foreign assistance to Ethiopia to continue, unquote. So despite canceling an election and killing the citizens who dared to have an election anyway, Karen Bass wants the money to continue to flow to the privatizing government. So this is all about democracy, right? Okay. And so that was written in October, and it didn't go anywhere in Congress, at least not yet. This is on my Dingleberry search list for the NDAA. But the violence of the election-canceling government only escalated in November, with the military conquering at least 5 cities in the region that dared to vote. So here's Yosef Badwaza. He is the senior advisor for Africa at the Freedom House, again, funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. This testimony was on December 3rd.
The devastating developments of the past 4 weeks have brought immeasurable human suffering and the destruction of livelihoods, and appear to have returned Ethiopia to yet another protracted civil war, nearly 30 years after it emerged from its last. These tragic events have also dealt a deadly blow to what would have been one of the most consequential democratic transitions on the African continent.
So, Ethiopia is doing all kinds of undemocratic things and still has our official support. But the violence is getting so overwhelming that we'll just have to see what happens there. But it's on the watch list, for sure. And this was just the beginning of the Africa rabbit hole, because the list of countries on the radar of National Endowment for Democracy's board member Karen Bass, oh my Lord.
We see similar patterns in Cote d'Ivoire as the executive branch legalizes the deviation in democratic institutions to codify non-democratic actions. We have similar concerns about Guinea and are going to be very watchful of upcoming elections there and in Burkina Faso, the Central African Republic, Chad, Gabon, Ghana, Niger, and Somalia.
I can't keep up. And so basically, Africa is the Wild West right now. The World Trade System is making claims all over the continent and is in the process of fundamentally transforming it. And we here in the United States have no idea. And I like to think I'm generally well informed due to doing this job for the last 8 years. And Agenda 2068, this was all news to me. And so basically, for those of you who have emailed to offer your assistance in reading the 4,517-page NDAA in January, I definitely need your help with Africa. Specifically, what would really help is that when you give me the information, I need the section numbers of the parts of the NDAA you think I should see closely. I need summaries of what the hell is going on in the country that is being addressed in that section. And I'm especially interested in the status of privatization reforms, if there are any. And I need links to whatever you use to gather the information that you share with me, because I can't use anything that isn't sourced. But there is a major World Trade System play going down on the continent of Africa. I'm sure that there are so many fascinating stories about what's happening there, funded by our tax money, while exactly no one here is paying attention. And so, Congressional Dish community, let's pay attention. And thank you in advance to anyone willing to help me out with this, either with research or with funding. And just for you researchers, anyone who provides a significant amount of well-sourced research that actually gets used in the production of an upcoming episode, you will get an official researcher credit for that episode, which I will be happy to vouch for. Now, obviously, who gets these credits is going to be entirely subjective, but the research needs to, again, be significant. 1 or 2 links isn't going to cut it. But I know some of you are professionals capable of submitting professional caliber work, and even though, this is a 2-person operation and neither of us are getting paid all that amazingly, so I can't afford to pay anyone else, but I'm willing to help you build your resume if you've earned it. So for those that have asked, yes, you can get research credits, but I don't just hand those out to anyone. So that's how that works. But yeah, a lot of work lies ahead of me here with the NDAA and the government funding. But what's happened after I have done the research for this episode is I'm actually pretty excited, because no matter what, even though it's going to be a lot of work, it's guaranteed to be fascinating. Because for better or worse, the World Trade System is about to get control of the executive branch of our government back. They kind of always had Congress. But when Joe Biden takes over as president, which despite Donald Trump's efforts, I'm positive he will do on January 20th. But when Joe Biden is president, World Trade System has us back. And there will be a lot of talk of building back better, using our money to support democracies around the world. And it's the National Defense Authorization Act where that support, the military support, since we're the muscle for this system, is going to be authorized. And this bill, this NDAA, was finished after they knew that Joe Biden would be back in charge. And so I want to know what Congress is telling him he's officially allowed to do. And so, as we end this historic year and the last Congress of the Trump administration, and while the corporate media focuses on celebrating the return to normal that the Biden administration is promising to bring, I'm going to see exactly what kind of normal we're in store for. Because normal to me means getting back to work on enlarging this economic system until it's truly global, until everything that can be privatized and done for a profit by a multinational corporation is. Until the global supplies of fossil fuels and minerals and water and human beings who do the actual work for these companies. Until everything of actual value is produced to benefit the investor class. And when I say investor class, I'm not talking about people that own thousands or even millions of dollars in stock. Those are the crumbs that the middle class people get so that we'll go along with all of this. No, what I'm talking about is that the World Trade System laws clearly benefit the richest people in the world, a very small group of people, the families who count their wealth in the billions, who are writing the laws of the global economic system so that the majority of the wealth flows through multinationals into the stock markets and into their pockets. Even when they brag that their system has lifted so many people out of poverty, which it has. But that's only because the multinationals have written themselves the legal ability, the freedom to labor shop around the world. Because desperate people are cheap labor. They're very profitable. And they have been able to go and hire people who are thrilled to work for $1 a day. And then the world traders go to Davos and pat each other on the backs on the ski lifts for a job well done helping the poor. But all of their bullshit aside about how they're doing all of this for us, they're such good people. The fact of the matter is that the richest families in the world want all the money, and it's a story as old as time. And I don't know if we can stop the world trade system. And honestly, I don't even know if we want to, because I don't think what China is offering is any better. And global rules seem like a good idea, but it matters who writes those rules, and it matters who those rules benefit. And right now, the specific rules are being written by corporate servants. And we know this. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was written literally behind closed doors. We documented all this as it happened, with no one, not even members of Congress, allowed to see the text. But 600 representatives from multinational corporations were in that room helping them write it. And so this is very clearly an undemocratic system designed by and for them. It's clear. And I guess if there's any activism in what I'm doing here, it's to change that aspect of the world trade system, not necessarily even take it down. But I want a global society where the laws are written to benefit the majority of humans, specifically the working class, because the majority of humans are working class. And I don't like the world that they're building on the global scale. I don't like that they're building an economic system that is designed to funnel wealth to billionaires, wealth created by the labor of everyone else. And when you talk about labels for all this system, I call it the world trade system. A lot of people like to call what we're seeing here capitalism, but this isn't about some ism. This isn't an economic theory. There are laws on paper. There are institutions in existence. There are actual humans with names that we know are writing these laws and getting these institutions to make it global. We have specifics. And until we learn those specifics, we can't be effective in getting them changed for the benefit of us. And I really feel like I'm just starting to grasp the big picture, But it's taken 17 years of obsessing over it to get even here. I didn't even know about the World Trade Organization until I was more than 100 episodes into this weird project. And I didn't know until this episode that there are huge changes happening in Africa right now. And I guess that's the word that just keeps going through my head. Just it all feels so huge, just overwhelmingly huge and important, and so far off of everyone's radar that I feel like I'm a Martian. But at least I have you, my Martian friend. And I don't know if we can change any of this. But I do know that connecting these dots and showing other people what's happening on the global level, that's the first step to changing it. Because we can't solve problems that we're unaware of. And so I guess that's what my goal for the next Congress is going to be, to document what's happening so that those who want to be aware can be. And if you'd like to help me do this, I can't take advertising money, because I can't have you wondering if I'm telling you something because I'm being paid to say it or if because I think it's true, We have to have a relationship built on trust. And so I need the freedom to say the things that could get me fired in the corporate world, which is, in this episode, just about everything that I said. And so to allow me the freedom to say what I need to say, what you can do is please participate in the value for value business model that I've chosen to fund my career with. Basically, the way this works is I create these episodes for you and you pay what you think the episodes are worth. And so that gives you a lot of freedom to decide what has value to you and what doesn't. Don't like an episode? Fine, don't pay for it. But if you love an episode, please pay for it. And the amount of value we exchange, I leave that entirely up to you. If you do participate, though, you have an important role in this podcast as a producer of it. And you get thanked and can have your production notes read in the bonus thank you episodes. You also get access, as long as you're cool to me, don't be rude, but you also will get access to my behind the scenes community in my green room, which is a private feed where I feel like I can talk more freely amongst my coworkers and not expose my less filtered thoughts to the wrath of internet trolls. And you can access the green room immediately by pledging to pay for the show per episode on Patreon, or you can use any of the payment methods listed in the show notes or on congressionaldish.com to pay whatever you think is fair, and also send us your email address. And then you can wait a few days or like a week until my sister or I are able to add you to the other green room feed. Because we're a real small operation over here, you kind of have to be patient with us, but we'll get you in there eventually. And there's some good green room content I know for sure coming up for you around Christmas, because my new podcasting buddy, Andrew Heaton, he's the host of The Political Orphanage, and he's going to join me in the green room for a chat about his time as a congressional staffer. And we're going to do this JRE style, because we've both blocked out at least 2 hours on our schedule, and we're just going to talk, and I'm excited for that. But you know, Andrew and Justin Robert Young, who's the host of Politics, I really want to get to know these guys better, because while I have some wonderful, wonderful friends in the podcasting community who I truly love and appreciate and who have helped me build this podcast in so many ways, even though I do have this community of podcasters, I've always felt a little alone in the community because my show is so different from everybody else, even my political podcasting friends, because they either do conversational shows or there's like Erica Mandy. She is a fantastic journalist who hosts The Newsworthy, which gives you the important news of the day in about 10 minutes. But she's so professional that she won't even talk about her political opinions, even off the air. So I love her and her work, and I admire her so much, but what we do is very different. But until I met Justin and Andrew recently, I hadn't become friends with anyone in the podcasting industry who was producing a solo show about politics that didn't preach to one of the two political parties, and who were just like nice guys. And then within a span of about a month, all of a sudden, I knew two people that seemed to fit that mold. And so I really want to get to know them both more. And I'm starting with Andrew in the green room on Christmas week. And so get yourselves into the green room if you want to hear that unedited conversation over the holidays. But I am so grateful for every single Congressional Dish producer and executive producer, which are people who have contributed at least $535. And we do have a new executive producer for episode 220, which was Postal Service Sabotage. And that is longtime producer of the podcast, Jose Huerta. So congratulations, Jose, on becoming an executive producer. And he sent in a note for all of us. So he said, hello from Idaho to all the Congressional Dish family. He says, Jen, I want to congratulate you on how much the podcast has grown in the time that I've been a listener. I've been listening for 6 years, 5 maybe. I think the idea of executive producers is a great one. It is my new financial goal to become executive producer of at least one episode per year. So enclosed is a personal check of only $15 dated in late July because it takes me a long time to do things. But most important is my contribution of $535 to be executive producer of episode 220 about the post office, paid for with a money order that I got at my post office. Thank you for all the work you do and the information you share. Stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, stay amazing. Jose Huerta. And he said, P.S. My pups say hi. Well, say hello to Bryn for me and your other puppies. Bryn is the only one whose name I remember because I still have a picture of Bryn here in my house. It made it to Los Angeles with me when I moved. But Jose, you've been such a wonderful member of this community for so long. So thank you so much for becoming an executive producer. I'm so happy to have your name on one of the episodes. And if anyone else wants to become a executive producer, the price is $535. That can be cumulative or a lump sum like Jose has done here for episode 220. And $535 was the price set by our first executive producer, and it's $1 for every member of Congress. Basically, the way it works with executive producer credits is you get to be heard by myself and the rest of the community at the end of a main episode like this, and you get listed as an executive producer on the episode of your choice, because you should get to choose what episode you put your name on, and whichever episode you're proudest to support, you know? And these are real credits. We have a list on standby in case anyone asks me to verify it on LinkedIn or wherever you want to put the credit. When I vouch for you, I mean it. And I do have an end of year special for executive producerships for the end of 2020. Until the Senate is decided, we are going to run a special where an executive producer credit is available for $435 because we don't know which party won the 100-person Senate yet. And so the special is that you can get an executive producer credit if you hit $435 or more before the 117th Senate is decided. And that's going to be decided by whatever happens in the Georgia election on January 5th. Because what's going down on January 5th is there's going to be a special runoff election for both of Georgia's Senate seats. And if either of the Republican senators who are trying to get rehired, so the senator who trades stocks all day instead of governing, David Perdue, and the never was elected to the seat to begin with, Queen of Wall Street, Kelly Loeffler, if either of them win election, then Mitch McConnell keeps his ability to play dictator of the Senate for the Republicans. But if both Democrats win, then Mitch McConnell is sidelined and the Democratic Party gets 2 years to maybe change some laws, if they choose to, because the Democratic Party does seem to specialize in lip service and wasting their power. But whatever happens, we are not going to know who's controlling the Senate before January 5th. And so since the governing ability of those 100 senators is unknown until then, we will discount the executive producer credit by $100 for a total representing just the membership of the House of Representatives, $435 until January 5th. So with that, thank you for making Congressional Dish possible. I know I get frustrated with it sometime, but I really do love this job. And more than anything, I love this community. And so thank you. I wish you a happy whatever holiday you choose to celebrate and a happy new year, because this is the last episode of the year. And I will be back with a thank you episode on January 5th or 6th to update us on what will be the Senate makeup of the 116th Congress. And obviously, I will tell you everything that went down with the NDAA and funding and all of that. Although, if you want to know in real time, follow me on Twitter at Jen Briney, because that is where I'm retweeting all of that information. But yeah, we've pretty much made it through another Congress. So, yay! All right, happy holidays. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.